A widow stood alone on the front step of a cabin that was never meant to last another winter. The valley stretched out before her, white and indifferent, and the mountains to the north rose so high they seemed to lean forward, the way a person leans when they want to hear what you have to say, but have already decided not to believe you. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 34 years old. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been working without help for a long time. Strong across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, stained at the fingertips in ways that never fully washed out. She had dark hair she wore pulled back without ceremony, and eyes the color of creek water in late autumn, clear and moving, and not entirely warm. She had been standing on that step for a long time, but to understand why she was standing there, and what she was looking at, you have to go back to the morning after her husband's funeral, because that was the morning everything truly began. The ground was still frozen when Garrett Finch arrived. He came on horseback, alone, with the particular patience of a man who has already decided how a conversation will end. He dismounted without hurrying. He tied his horse to the post Thomas had set into the ground the first spring they arrived, and he stood for a moment looking at the cabin the way a person looks at something they have already, privately, begun to think of as theirs. Clara watched him from the window. She had not slept. She did not think she would sleep again for some time. Garrett was Thomas's younger brother. Younger by 4 years, though he had spent most of those years trying to close the distance. He was not an unkind man, not exactly. He was the kind of man who genuinely believed that wanting something gave him a right to it, and that believing he was helping made him helpful, regardless of what the person being helped actually needed. He knocked. Clara opened the door. He did not come inside. He stood on the step with his hat in his hands, the gesture of a man performing consideration. And he spoke in the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed what he is about to say. He told her the land was too large for one person. He told her the winters were too hard. He told her he had spoken to a man in the next county who would pay a fair price, and that fair was more than she would get if she waited until necessity forced the decision. He told her all of this with the smooth confidence of someone delivering good news. Then he said the thing Clara would carry with her for the rest of that year. The thing she would hear again in the dark at 2 a.m. when doubt came close and the fire burned low. Thomas would have wanted his children fed, Clara, not frozen to death for your pride. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold came in around the edges of the open door. Eli and Rose were still asleep in the room behind her. She could hear the soft rhythm of their breathing, and that sound was the steadiest thing in the world. Thomas, she said, would have wanted his children to keep what he built. She closed the door. Garrett did not argue. He simply nodded once, put his hat back on, and rode away at the same unhurried pace at which he had arrived. He was not worried. He had time. He knew about winters in this valley, and he understood that time in a place like this had a way of making decisions for people who refused to make them for themselves. What Garrett did not know, what almost no one in the valley knew, was that Clara Voss had a father who had spent 30 years building things that people said couldn't be built. His name had been Edward. He had come from Cornwall as a young man with rough hands and a particular stubbornness about the relationship between stone and cold. He had worked in places where the winters were long and the fuel was scarce, and he had learned, through trial and through failure, and through the specific education that comes from sleeping in structures you built yourself and waking up to discover what they did and did not do, that the way most people thought about keeping warm was wrong. Not a little wrong, fundamentally wrong. He had written it all down in a notebook, a small sewn paper journal filled with cramped handwriting and diagrams drawn in fading ink. He had given the notebook to Clara when she married Thomas and moved north. She had carried it with her for 11 years without fully reading it. That evening, after Garrett had gone and the children were fed and the fire was banked, Clara took the notebook from the trunk beneath the bed and sat with it in her lap. She turned the pages slowly. Her father's handwriting was familiar in the way that things are familiar when you learn them before you knew you were learning. Before you understood that the lesson would matter. Before you could have guessed the shape of the life that would one day require it. She read about stone, about thickness and mass, and the way dense material absorbs heat, not quickly, but deeply. The way a vessel fills, slowly and completely, and then releases what it has been given long after the source of warmth is gone. She read about burying the north side of a structure into a hillside where the ground holds a temperature that the air above cannot touch. She read about low ceilings that keep warmth where the people are, instead of letting it gather uselessly near the roof. She read until the lamp began to dim. Then she turned to the last page. There was a note folded in half, tucked against the inside cover. She had not noticed it before, or perhaps she had noticed it and left it, the way you leave a door closed when you are not sure you are ready for what is behind it. She did not open it, not yet. She closed the notebook, set it on the table, and sat for a long time in the quiet dark of the cabin, listening to the wind find the gaps in the logs. The same gaps it found every winter, growing wider every year, patient and persistent, and completely indifferent to how much wood she burned or how little sleep she got. She thought about Thomas, not his face exactly, though she could still find that when she tried, but the way he had moved through a room, with a particular purposefulness that she had loved before she knew what to call it. He had been a man who understood that work done well was its own argument. He had not been given to speeches about what he believed. He simply built things. He built them true, and he built them to last, and then he stepped back and let the building speak. She had loved that about him. She understood it now in a way she had not when he was alive, the way you sometimes understand a thing more completely when it is gone than when it was present. The wind moved through the east window gap, the gap she had stuffed and restuffed through 3 winters, the gap that always found its way back to open because the log above it had settled a fraction more each year, slow and patient and unstoppable, like the cold itself. She was not going to fight the cold anymore. She was going to outthink it. The snow left the hillside to the north in the first week of spring. Not all at once, slowly, the way winter releases things, grudgingly, a little at a time, as though it hasn't entirely decided to go. It revealed a long shelf of flat ground at the base of the slope. The hillside rose behind it like a wall, blocking the north wind naturally, and sandstone outcroppings scattered across the rise offered the kind of material that her father's notebook described in specific and affectionate detail. Clara stood on the front step and looked at that hillside for a long time. Eli came out behind her, 9 years old, thin and quiet and observant in the way of children who have learned that the world is serious. He stood beside her and looked at the same thing she was looking at. "Ma," he said, "are we building something?" Clara had not said it aloud yet, had not made it real in that way. but she had been thinking it since the night she sat with the notebook, and the thinking had moved, the way convictions move, from uncertain to settled, without her noticing the exact moment of the change. "Your grandfather," she said, "built rooms that stayed warm without fire. He said stone doesn't argue with cold." She paused. "He said stone waits." Eli looked at the hillside. Then he looked at his mother. "Can we do that?" Clara looked at the ground that would become a foundation, at the rock that would become walls, at the slope that would become shelter. "We're going to find out," she said, and somewhere behind them, inside the trunk beneath the bed, a notebook waited with its last page still unread, written by a man who had known, long before his daughter did, exactly what kind of storm was coming. She began with the creek. Not because the creek was the easiest place to start, but because her father's notebook said that water-tumbled stone had a particular quality, smooth-surfaced and dense, shaped by years of pressure into forms that fit together with surprising efficiency. The notebook called it honest stone. Stone that had already been tested by something harder than itself and had come through without cracking. Clara understood, reading that her father had not been writing only about rock. She built a simple sled from salvaged planks, 2 runners, a flat bed, rope handles worn smooth from previous use. On mornings when the mule was needed for other work, she pulled it herself. The load was never light. By the end of the first week, her shoulders had developed a deep, settled ache that she managed the way she managed most discomforts in those months, by not giving it more attention than it required. On the 3rd morning, she looked back and found Eli behind her on the trail. He had not asked permission. He had simply appeared, 20 feet back, pulling a short board he'd nailed into a rough, flat shape, one medium-sized river stone sitting in the center of it. He was watching the ground in front of his feet with the focused concentration of someone carrying something that matters. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned around and kept walking. From that day forward, they worked together every morning without discussing it. There was nothing to discuss. The work was there. They were there. That was the whole of the arrangement. Rose came out on the 4th morning and watched them from the cabin step for a long time. 6 years old, barefoot in the spring mud, a biscuit in each hand. Then she went back inside and came back with her small canvas bag, which she filled with river pebbles from the path and dragged to the work site with great seriousness and deposited in a pile that she declared was for the corners. Clara thanked her without smiling. Eli told his sister, with the authority of a 9-year-old who has been doing this longer, that cornerstones needed to be larger. Rose considered this and said she knew that, and that these ones were for the very bottom of the corners. Eli decided this was close enough to correct and let it go. Clara noted, without saying anything, that she had not heard Rose cough once that morning. The air was warming. The cold was retreating. For now, Ike Mathers came on the 5th day. He arrived without announcement, the way men who have spent most of their lives outdoors tend to arrive. Quietly, from a direction you weren't watching, already present before you noticed him coming. He was somewhere past 60, with a face that had been worked on by decades of weather until it had settled into something that no longer changed much, regardless of what he was thinking. He had been trapping and hunting in this country longer than most of the valley's current residents had been alive, and he carried that history in his posture. Not arrogance, just the particular ease of a person who has made their peace with a difficult place, and no longer needs to prove anything to it. He stood at the edge of the work site and watched Clara mix mortar for a while. She was aware of him watching. She did not stop what she was doing. Finally, he said, without particular inflection, "Your clay ratio's off. Mix it wetter and it'll shrink when it cures. Too dry and it won't bond right." Clara looked at the batch she was working. Then she looked at him. "Show me," she said. He did. He crouched down with the ease of a man whose knees had not yet registered any complaints, worked the mixture with his hands, explained the consistency she was looking for, the way it should hold a shape without cracking at the edges, the way it should feel between the fingers. He had clearly done this before, or something close enough to it that the knowledge transferred without difficulty. He did not explain where he had learned it. She did not ask. When he stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers, he looked at the hillside she had chosen, at the slope that would back the north wall, at the flat shelf of ground at its base, at the sandstone outcroppings scattered across the rise. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are revising an opinion they had already formed. "Seen something like this once," he said. "Long time ago. Different country, different materials." He paused. Worked. Then he left. He would come back, not every day, and never when she was expecting him, but consistently enough that his presence became part of the rhythm of the work. A quiet check, a brief correction, occasionally a tool left propped against the stone wall in the morning that hadn't been there the night before. He never made a production of any of it. Clara understood that this was his version of full-throated support, and she accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. The first time Aldous Harrow came, it was a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of summer. He rode alone and stopped his horse well back from the work site, in the particular way of a man who wants to look without committing to engagement. He sat there for several minutes, taking in the low stone courses rising from the flat ground, the hillside Clara had chosen as backing for the north wall, the mortar joints, the care with which the different stone types had been distributed, heavier material at the base, river rock through the middle courses, the flat sandstone slabs she was saving for the corners. Then he dismounted and walked closer. Harrow was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with the unhurried movements of someone who had been doing physical work for so long that effort had become indistinguishable from rest. He had built more structures in the valley than any other man. He knew it. The knowing had settled into him over the years in the way that expertise settles when it is genuine and long practiced. Not as arrogance, exactly, but as a kind of bedrock certainty that was almost impossible to shift, because it had been built on things that were actually true. That was what made him complicated. He was not wrong about most things. He was wrong about this one. And the wrongness was harder to see because it was surrounded by so much that was right. He looked at the mortar joints. He looked at the stone selection. He looked at the site. "Stone is cold," he said, "not unkind, simply certain. Everybody knows that." Clara did not stop working. "Stone that's been given warmth holds it long after the fire's ash. Have you ever put your hand on a root cellar wall in January, Mr. Harrow?" There was a pause. He had. He did not say so directly. "It's warmer than the air outside," Clara continued, "because the earth around it keeps a steady temperature, and the stone has absorbed it. I'm building the same principle into a room with a fire in it. The stone takes the heat. It gives it back slowly, all night, after the fire burns low." Harrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had actually come to say. "I've built cabins for most of the families in this valley. If you come through the winter on less wood than a timber cabin uses, people will ask me why they paid for my work." Clara looked up at him steadily. "You build houses to sell. I'm building a house to live in. We're not in competition." Something moved through Harrow's expression. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to the particular discomfort of a man who has been answered more directly than he expected and is not sure what to do with the surplus. "Moisture collects in stone walls," he said finally. "Mold follows. I've seen it." "I'll keep that in mind," Clara said. He rode back to the trail without looking back. Clara watched him go. Then she returned to the mortar. She was not angry. She had expected resistance from the moment she decided to build. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific form resistance would take. Not one large obstacle, but many small ones, arriving from different directions, wearing different faces. What she also had not anticipated was the name. It arrived through Eli, who came home one evening 2 weeks into August with a particular quality of quiet around him. Not his usual silence, which was the silence of a child thinking, but the tight-wound quiet of a child holding something that embarrasses him on someone else's behalf. He told her, looking at the table, that a young man named Wade had been at the settlement store that afternoon. That Wade had said something about the construction site in a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. That the room had found it funny. "What did he call it?" Clara asked. Eli told her. "Voss's folly." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised her son. "He's not entirely wrong." Eli looked up. "Building something that hasn't been built before, in a place where people have already decided what works. That is a kind of folly." She looked at the window, beyond which the half-finished stone walls sat in the last of the evening light, low and rough, and entirely themselves. "The question is whether it's the foolish kind or the other kind." Eli thought about this. "What's the other kind?" "The kind that turns out to be right," Clara said. She stood up and began clearing the table. Eli watched her. "We should keep the name," he said. Clara looked at him. "For later," he said, "when it turns out to be right." That evening, after Rose was asleep and Eli was nearly so, Clara went out to the work site alone. The air was warm still. The particular warm of a summer evening after a day of labor, when the ground releases what it has absorbed through the long hours of sunlight. She walked the perimeter of the low stone walls, running her hand along the top course the way she had seen her father run his hand along his finished work. He had done it not to inspect. She understood now. He did it to feel it, to know it through the skin. She stopped at the north section, the section she had spent the most time on, the section buried deepest into the hillside where the earth would hold what the air could not. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. It held a faint warmth from the day's sun. Not much, but real. She stood there for a long time. Edmund Wren came the following week with a thermometer in one coat pocket and a blank notebook in the other. He was 41, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the careful posture of someone who had learned early that the world rewards precision over enthusiasm. He taught at the small school in the valley and subscribed to several scientific journals that arrived by post weeks late and sometimes water-damaged, which he read with the focused attention of a man who understood that access to good thinking was something you worked for, not something that came to you. He introduced himself briefly, explained that he was interested in collecting temperature data on structures in the valley for reasons he was working out as he went, and asked if she had any objection to him taking some readings. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Do what you need to do," she said. He did. He worked quietly, measuring interior temperatures at regular intervals, noting the time since the last fire had been lit, comparing interior readings to the outside air. He moved without intruding, asked nothing beyond the space to observe, and when he was finished, he thanked her in the careful way of a man who understood he had been given something of value. Clara noticed that he thanked her for her time, not for her permission. The distinction was small. It was not nothing. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He brought readings from his own cabin for comparison. He began arriving slightly before he needed to, and leaving slightly later than was strictly necessary, occasionally noticing things that needed doing. A loose rope on the sled, a split in one of the salvaged planks, and quietly addressing them before he left. Eli noticed before Clara did. "Mr. Wren comes a lot," Eli observed one evening with the careful neutrality of a 9-year-old who has drawn a conclusion but is being strategic about how he presents it. "He's collecting data," Clara said. Eli looked at the biscuit he was eating. "Sure, Ma," he said, "but none of that. Not Harrow's opposition, not Wren's quiet presence, not even the steady accumulation of the walls themselves, was the thing that nearly undid her." It was a Tuesday night in late summer when Rose came down with a fever that rose fast and climbed high, and the old log cabin showed Clara, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what it had been showing her for 3 winters, that it was not enough, had never been enough, and would not be enough no matter how much wood she burned or how many rags she stuffed into the gaps above the east window. The fever spiked in the early hours of the morning. The fire had burned low. Clara had let it drop too far, had been too tired, had misjudged the timing the way you misjudge things when you are running on the edge of your reserves, and the edge keeps moving. By the time she woke, the far corner of the cabin was cold in a way that went past uncomfortable into something sharper. 3 matches left in the tin. She stood in the dark with the tin in her hand and thought, with a clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces, that she had been here before. Not in this exact cabin, not with these exact children, but in this exact arithmetic, where the things you have are not enough for the things you need, and something has to give. She thought about her father. He had shown her once, on a camping trip when she was small, how to start a fire without matches, using flint and a small piece of carbon steel he kept in his kit, striking them together at the right angle over a nest of dried grass until a spark caught and held. He had made it look easy, the way he made most things look easy, while explaining all the ways it could go wrong and why those ways mattered. Clara set the tin down, found the small piece of flint she had pocketed from the creek bed weeks ago, not with any specific plan, only because her father had taught her to pick up useful things when she saw them, found the steel striker at the bottom of the toolbox, pulled dried grass from the bundle she kept for tinder near the stove. It took 40 minutes. Her hands were shaking from cold before the spark caught, and her knees hurt from crouching, and twice she came close to giving up and using one of the 3 matches. And both times she thought of her father's voice, the words that had become, over months of building, something close to a heartbeat. She kept striking. The fire came back, slowly, carefully, from almost nothing. She fed it until it was strong, and then she sat beside the stove with Rose in her arms, feeling the warmth begin to move back into the room. She held the child against her chest and listened to the small breathing. Still too fast, still too shallow, but steadying. The fever hadn't broken, but it wasn't climbing anymore. She stayed that way for a long time, long enough for the fire to find its rhythm, long enough for the room to recover what it had lost, long enough for her arms to ache in a way that had nothing to do with cold. She looked down at Rose's face in the firelight. The child's lips were slightly parted, her lashes casting small shadows on her cheeks. She looked fragile in a way she didn't look in daytime, the way sleeping children look vulnerable in ways that waking children don't permit you to notice. Clara thought, never again. Not this. Never again this particular arithmetic. She thought, finish the walls. Eli appeared in the doorway of the small back room. He had been awake. She had known he was awake. He looked at his sister, then at his mother, then at the fire. He did not say anything. He went and got his blanket and sat on the floor near the stove, and went back to sleep there, between his mother and the door. In the morning, Rose opened her eyes and said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to make much of her own suffering, "My hands are cold, Mama." Clara looked at those small hands, held them between her own, felt the coldness of them, and the warmth of her own palms surrounding them, and thought about walls and stone and memory and what it meant to give warmth and have it given back. "I know," she said. "I'm fixing that." It was a week after Rose's fever broke that Eli found Stone. He came back from the edge of the settlement in the late afternoon, leading the dog on a length of rope he'd braided from spare cord, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something fragile. The dog was old. That was the first thing visible about him. Old and thin, moving with a stiffness in the back legs that spoke of years and hard weather. One ear was torn at the tip. His coat was the color of river mud after rain, not elegant, but thorough. He had been left at the dump at the edge of town. Eli said this without editorializing, but his face said everything his voice did not. "He got left behind too, Ma," Eli said. Clara looked at the dog. The dog looked at Clara with the particular expression of an animal that has been through enough to have given up on first impressions. Patient, watchful, making no demands, but clearly hoping. "One more mouth we can't afford," Clara said. Eli said nothing. He knew his mother well enough to understand that this sentence was not the same as no. Stone, Eli named him that evening, for reasons he did not fully explain and did not need to, slept his first night in the cabin near the stove. He did not make a sound. He found his spot without being shown it, turned around twice, and lay down as though he had always known where he belonged. In the morning, Clara found him lying beside Rose, who had curled toward him in her sleep, with one small hand resting on his flank. The child had not coughed once. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at this for a long moment. Then she turned and went to start the fire, and did not say anything about the dog. And that was that. The legal document arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by Preston Cobb with the manner of a man performing an unpleasant duty he would have preferred to assign to someone else. Cobb was the Valley's designated authority on matters of communal administration, a role without salary or formal power, but with considerable practical weight, because he was the man whose name appeared on correspondence and whose signature made things official. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful man, which in certain situations amounts to the same thing. He handed Clara the document and waited while she read it. It was written in the language that official discomfort tends to produce, formal, indirect, and dense with qualifications that softened nothing. It informed her that her dwelling construction was subject to review under territorial homestead standards, that she had 45 days to demonstrate that the structure met the requirements for a habitable improvement. That failure to satisfy the review would result in a reassessment of her claim. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and looked at Cobb. "Who drafted this?" Cobb did not answer directly. "There are concerns," he said, "about the unconventional nature of the construction. The Homestead Act does not specify building materials," Clara said. "A person can construct any improvement on their claim so long as they inhabit it and work the land. You know this." "The concern," Cobb said, "is whether it will serve as adequate shelter. Then send someone to measure the temperature inside the walls and compare it to the air outside. Send someone in January. The numbers will answer the question better than I can." Cobb held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. He was not unsympathetic, she thought. He was constrained. There was a difference. She was not sure, standing there in the afternoon light with the document in her hand, whether the difference mattered. 45 days, he said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Voss." He left. Stone, who had been lying near the south wall, stood and watched the man go until he was out of sight. Then he turned, walked back to his spot, and lay down again with a sigh that seemed to express the general opinion of the household. The night after the document came, Clara sat alone at the table after the children were asleep. The fire was low. Stone breathed steadily near the stove. The cabin made its nighttime sounds, the small creaks and shifts of wood settling, the wind finding the east window gap the way it always found it, patient as water finding low ground. She opened the notebook to the middle pages, not the last page, not yet, and read her father's descriptions of wall thickness and its relationship to how long warmth persisted. She read about the geometry of heat, the logic of mass. Then she set the notebook down and looked at the blank piece of paper in front of her. She did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. 45 days to meet the review. If she could not demonstrate that the structure held warmth adequately, she would lose the claim. Garrett would buy the land for the price he'd offered the morning after the funeral. She could take that money. She could take Eli and Rose to a larger town. There were schools there. There were people who had not yet decided who she was. It was not nothing. She picked up the pencil. The cabin was quiet. The wind moved. And then, from the room behind her, barely audible through the thin wall, Rose's voice, sleep soft, addressing something in a dream. "Warm, Mama." Just those two words, not even fully conscious, not directed at anyone present. Clara set the pencil down. She did not pick it up again. She closed the notebook, stood up, added a log to the fire, and went to check on her children. Rose was deeply asleep, one hand open beside her face, the other resting on Stone's flank. The dog opened one eye when Clara appeared, assessed the situation, and closed it again. "Stone doesn't argue with cold," Clara said very quietly, to no one in particular. "Stone waits." She blew out the lamp and went to bed. In the morning, she was back at the work site before sunrise. The walls rose through August and into September. Edmund Wren came twice a week with his thermometer and his notebook and his increasingly insufficient excuses for being there. He had begun bringing food, practical things, nothing that could be read as charity. A round of hard cheese, a small sack of dried beans. He left them on the sled without comment, and then went to do his measuring and pretended the food had always been there. The temperature measurements Wren had been collecting through the summer told a story that the numbers narrated more cleanly than any argument could. The interior of the stone structure, even incomplete, even unroofed, maintained a measurably different temperature than the surrounding air on the coldest mornings. Wren shared this at the settlement store on a Thursday afternoon. He presented it plainly: the numbers, the dates, the methodology. He did not editorialize. He did not draw conclusions aloud. Harrow was in the room. He listened. Then he said, in the register he used when he was declaring rather than discussing, "One summer of measurements on an incomplete structure tells you nothing about what it will do in January. I've been building in this valley for over 2 decades. I know what works." Wren looked at him. "You may be right," he said. "I'll keep measuring." Eli had come that afternoon, ostensibly to carry supplies. He stood near the door through the whole exchange, watching Harrow's face while Harrow listened to the numbers. On the walk home, Eli said nothing for a long time. Then, "Mr. Harrow knew the numbers were right. I could tell." Clara said, "How?" Eli said, "Because he stopped looking at Mr. Wren and started looking at the floor." Clara said nothing, but she filed the observation away because Eli's observations were rarely wrong and never wasted. Harrow rode home that afternoon and sat in the finest cabin he had ever built, and in the privacy of his own mind, with no one watching and nothing to prove. He did the arithmetic himself. He had been doing it privately for weeks. The numbers kept coming out the same way. He did not tell anyone what the numbers said. The roof went on in the first week of October. Sawed-over timber framing, thick and heavy, which her father's notebook described as the best insulator available in a place with more earth than anything else. Clara stood back from the finished structure on a cool morning when the light was still low and golden, and the first real cold of the season had begun to settle into the valley nights. She looked at what she had made. It was not beautiful. It was low and heavy, and settled into the hillside with the unpretentious permanence of something that had never been trying to impress anyone. The walls were rough. She was not a trained mason, and the stone showed the decisions and revisions of someone learning the work in real time. The 2 small windows on the south face were covered with oiled canvas rather than glass, but it was there. It was hers. Built from the ground up with her own hands and Eli's, from material she had pulled from the earth herself, following instructions written down by a man who had believed, long before she did, that she would one day need them. Rose, who had not been told in specific terms why they were moving, stood in the center of the main room on their first night and looked up at the low ceiling and the thick walls and the small fire burning in the new stone fireplace, and said with the confident simplicity of a 6-year-old who does not require more information than she has, "It's warm." Then she climbed into the low loft and went to sleep. Clara banked the fire at 10 o'clock and sat alone in the darkening room. The flame dropped to coals. The room continued to hold its warmth, not the aggressive heat of a fire burning at full output, not the desperate warmth of a structure fighting cold it cannot quite overcome. Just steadiness, patience, the warmth of walls that had been given something and were giving it back. She reached under the bench where she had moved the trunk and took out the notebook, held it in her lap without opening it, felt the worn leather under her fingers, the weight of it, the particular solidity of a thing that had been carried a long time. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about a root cellar in summer and a small hand pressed against a stone wall, and a voice saying, "Not cold, stable." She thought about Rose upstairs, sleeping without coughing. She thought, 45 days, 37 remaining. She thought, let them come. Outside, the October wind began to find its voice in the gaps between the hills. The temperature was dropping. The nights were getting longer. What was coming was coming. Inside the stone house, the walls held the warmth without argument. Stone doesn't argue with cold, her father had written. Stone waits. The trouble did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most serious trouble arrives, incrementally, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own, until the accumulation became something that could no longer be managed by dismissing individual pieces. It began with Eli's face. Clara had learned to read her son the way experienced people learn to read weather, not by any single indicator, but by the combination of small signs that meant something was coming before it fully arrived. The set of his jaw, the particular stillness he went to when he was holding something he hadn't decided yet whether to put down or carry further. He came home from the settlement store one afternoon in the second week of October with that stillness wrapped around him like a coat 2 sizes too large. He set down the small bundle of supplies Clara had sent him for, and he sat at the table and he looked at his hands. Clara waited. I heard Mr. Finch talking to Mr. Cobb, Eli said finally. She kept her hands occupied with what she was doing, the small discipline of appearing unchanged when something changes. What were they saying? Eli looked up. His eyes were the same color as his father's had been, and they held the same quality his father's had held, a directness that was not aggression, just the particular honesty of someone who has decided that looking away from things costs more than it saves. Mr. Finch said you weren't well, Eli said. In your mind, since Papa died. A pause. He said the children were living in an unsafe situation. The room was very quiet. Stone, lying near the south wall, lifted his head. Clara set down what was in her hands carefully. Then she looked at her son. He said this to Mr. Cobb? To Mr. Cobb and 2 other men I didn't know. Eli's voice was steady, but his hands on the table were not entirely still. He said someone should look into it, officially. Clara understood immediately what this was. It was not about her mental state. Garrett Finch had no particular opinion about her mental state and likely knew it was perfectly sound. It was about the fact that the legal document had 45 days written on it, and those days were running out, and the temperature readings Edmund Wren had been sharing were not moving in Garrett's direction, and Garrett was a man who adapted his approach when the first approach stopped working. It was no longer about the land. It was about Eli and Rose. Clara stood and walked to the south window. Outside, the stone walls of the house she had built stood low and solid against the hillside, the sod roof dark with recent rain, the whole structure so settled into the earth it looked as though it had grown there rather than been assembled. She thought about taking the money, about wider streets and warmer schools and the specific relief of anonymity, the way a person can breathe differently in a place where no one has already decided who they are. She thought about Garrett's price and whether it was still on the table and what it would buy. Then Eli said from behind her, Ma, just her name, nothing attached to it. But the way he said it, the weight he put into those 2 letters, the particular steadiness of a 9-year-old who is trying to be more than 9, pulled her back from wherever she had been going. She turned around. He was still sitting at the table, still looking at her. His eyes were frightened in the way children's eyes are frightened when they understand the situation more clearly than the adults around them wish they did. We're not leaving, she said. It was not a decision she made in that moment. She had made it on the night Rose said warm in her sleep, On the morning she lit a fire from flint and steel in the dark. On every morning she walked to the work site before sunrise and found Eli already there with his small board and his single stone. She had made it so many times by now that saying it aloud was simply acknowledging what had been true for months. Eli breathed out slowly. Stone put his head back down. Edmund Wren arrived the following morning earlier than usual. He knocked, which he did not always do, and when Clara opened the door, he stepped inside with the particular quality of movement that belongs to people carrying news they have been sorting through on the walkover, trying to find the best order in which to present it. He set a folded paper on the table. "I found this in the territory records," he said. "I've been looking through the old administrative filings for the past several weeks. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it." Clara looked at the paper without touching it. "It's a legal ruling," Wren said, "from roughly 20 years ago. A stonemason challenged a territorial authority's claim that his construction didn't meet the standards for a habitable homestead improvement. The territory argued the materials were non-standard. He argued that the function of the structure was what the law required to be demonstrated, not the materials used to achieve it." A pause. He won. Clara picked up the paper. She read it slowly. The legal language was dense and formal, the handwriting cramped from years of use, the edges of the document soft with age. She read it, and then she read the name of the mason at the top of the ruling, and for a moment the room seemed to do something unusual. Not move exactly, but rearrange itself slightly around her, the way the world rearranges itself when a thing you thought you understood turns out to be larger than you knew. The name was Edward Aldris. Her father had done this before, had stood in a courtroom or a hearing room in a different territory, in a different decade, with different walls and different mountains visible through whatever windows existed, and had made this argument and won it. And he had never told her. She read the ruling again, looked at the date, looked at the signature. There was no question. The name was correct. The trade was correct. The description of the construction techniques matched her father's notebook precisely. This was not coincidence. This was not a different man with the same name. Her father had walked this road before she did, had cleared some of it, had left the ruling in the records where it could be found by someone who knew to look. He knew, Clara said, not to Wren, or not only to Wren, to the room, to the notebook under the bench, to the father she had been building toward all summer without fully understanding it. He knew this might happen. Wren said quietly, "The precedent makes Garrett Finch's claim legally untenable. Cobb will know that when he sees it." Clara folded the paper carefully along its original creases, held it in both hands for a moment. "The notebook," she said. "There's a last page I haven't read." She looked at the trunk under the bench. Wren followed her gaze, but said nothing. "Not yet," Clara said, more to herself than to him. "Not yet." She set the document on the table, smoothed it with one hand, and looked out the south window at the sky. Something in the sky was wrong. She noticed it first as a quality of light, not the color exactly, but the quality of it, flattened. A yellowish gray that sat too low and too still, pressed against the ridge lines with the particular heaviness of something that has traveled a long way and arrived with intentions. She had seen this light once before, as a child, in Colorado. She had been sitting outside with her father when the light went that color, and he had stood up immediately and begun moving with a focused efficiency she recognized as a different category of action from his ordinary movements. He had said, moving, "Come inside now, and bring everything that matters." She had not understood then why the sky was significant. She understood it now. Stone had been restless since morning. He could not find his spot. He would lie down, then stand, then walk to the door, then return to a different location and try again. His eyes tracked things that weren't there. Eli had noticed. "What's wrong with him?" "He knows something," Clara said. She went to find Ike Mathers first. Ike looked at the sky for approximately 3 seconds. "Go home," he said. "Bring in everything you have outside. Fill every vessel you own with water before the night." She went to Harrow next, found him at the frame of a nearly complete barn, fitting a door with the calm precision of 25 years of work. She told him about the sky, about Stone, about the stillness and the quality of the air that had changed since noon. Harrow looked at the sky. He looked for longer than Ike had, with the evaluation of a man whose relationship to weather was professional as well as personal. Then he looked back at the door fitting and made a small adjustment. "Animals don't predict weather, Mrs. Voss," he said. Definitive. The voice of someone who has organized his understanding of the world into categories. And this suggestion was trying to enter a category where it didn't belong. She went to 3 families on the northern edge of the settlement whose homes she was most worried about. She went briefly to the store, where Wade was holding court with several younger men. Wade grinned. He said, to the room rather than to her, "The Stone woman's scared of her own shadow." The room laughed, not all of it, but enough. Clara left without responding. She walked home in the failing afternoon light, with Stone pacing close beside her and the sky pressing lower above the ridge lines, and she thought about her father saying, "Bring everything that matters," and she thought, "Let it come. Whatever it is, let it come." The storm did not announce itself. That was the thing about it. The thing that made it different from the storms Clara had experienced before. This arrived fully formed in the deep hours of the night, like a door opening onto something that had been on the other side for a long time, fully assembled and waiting. The sound reached the stone house first. It was not what Clara expected. She had expected wind, but wind as she had known it had always seemed like something the world was doing, a byproduct of its own processes. This sound was different. Something else entirely using wind as its medium, a shrieking, sustained and high, that held its pitch the way a living thing holds a scream, without the hesitation of breathing. Clara sat up in the dark before she was fully awake. Stone was already at the door, standing, not pacing, facing it with a stillness that was different from his earlier restlessness. This was the stillness of an animal that has moved past alertness into something older. Clara lit the lamp. The flame went sideways in a draft that had no visible source, then steadied. She checked the children. Eli was awake. Rose was asleep, or close enough to it. She had always been a heavy sleeper, Rose, the kind of child who could sleep through a thunderstorm but would wake at the sound of a door opening quietly in the middle of the night. Clara added 2 logs to the fire, placing them the way her father had shown her, not for immediate heat, but for long burn, positioned to feed each other gradually through the hours ahead. Then she went to the south window and lifted the edge of the canvas. She could see nothing, not darkness in the ordinary sense. Darkness is the absence of light, and you can understand it, navigate it, predict what it contains. This was a white obliteration that the lamplight struck and bounced back from without penetrating. The world outside the canvas had been replaced by something that did not have edges. The temperature inside the stone house was what it always was at this hour after a banked fire, not warm in the way of summer warmth, but steady, settled. The walls doing what they had been doing since the first fire she'd lit in them, absorbing, holding, releasing according to their own deep and patient schedule, indifferent to what the air outside was doing. The canvas moved at its edges. Nothing else moved. "Ma?" Eli's voice from behind her. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room, watching her with his father's eyes. "Is it bad?" She looked at him for a moment. He was 9 years old. He had woken alone in the night and come to find her without calling out, without waking his sister, without making more noise than necessary. He was his father's son in every way that mattered. "Yes," she said, because he would know if she said no, and knowing you've been lied to is worse than knowing the truth. But we're all right in here. Eli looked at the walls, at the stone fireplace, at Stone, who had come to sit beside Eli in the particular way he had of placing himself adjacent to the person who most needed him. "Because of what you built," Eli said. It was not a question. Clara looked at her son, at this boy who had carried stones in the summer heat without being asked, who had learned mortar consistency from an old trapper's scarred hands, who had sat up feeding a fire when he was 8 years old and never said a word about it. And she said, "Because of what we built." The knock came on the second night, not a frantic knock, not the hammering of someone in immediate crisis. A single, deliberate knock. The kind that takes effort to produce because the hand making it is not working the way hands are supposed to work. Clara opened the door. The cold entered ahead of the people. A wall of it, solid and immediate, carrying the full weight of what the outside had become. And then Mabel Stout was in the doorway, with her daughter pressed against her side, and the child's face was the wrong color. Not the healthy, cold flush of someone who has been outside too long, but the grayish stillness of someone whose body has begun the process of protecting its center by abandoning its surface. Mabel Stout was the woman who had sat across from Clara at community gatherings and expressed concern about her, loudly, publicly, with the particular performance of worry that is more about the performer than the worried about. She had never, to Clara's knowledge, said a single word in Clara's defense. What stood in the doorway now had very little in common with that woman. The composed presentation was entirely gone. What remained was a mother with a child who needed warmth, and no other place to find it. Clara stepped back and opened the door wider. She watched the girl register the warmth of the room, not dramatically, not with any performance, just the small physical fact of a body that has been cold too long finding the opposite of cold, and responding to it the way living things respond to what they need. The girl sat down on the floor against the wall nearest the door, put her back against the stone, and closed her eyes. The stone was warm. The child felt it through her coat. Mabel put her hand flat against the wall, stood there, said nothing. Clara put more water on to heat. Harrow arrived an hour later. He came alone, on foot, which meant he had walked through whatever was outside for however long it took to walk from his place to hers. When he appeared in the doorway, the cold came with him like a companion he couldn't shake. Stone stood, did not growl, just stood, watchful, assessing. Harrow looked at the dog, then at Clara, He was a big man, and he had been out in serious weather many times before. And even so, he looked reduced, not in size, but in the particular quality of certainty that had always been the most visible thing about him. He stood on the threshold without speaking. His hands were in his pockets. His hat was gone. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came inside. He stood in the center of the room and felt the warmth the way you feel something you didn't expect and can't immediately account for. With the whole body, not just the skin. He put a hand on the west wall. Then he moved to the north wall, the wall buried deepest in the hillside, and pressed his palm flat against it. The stone was warm, not fire warm, not the aggressive heat of proximity to flame. The deep, patient warmth of mass that had been doing its work for months, that had absorbed so many fires by now that the warmth had become structural, part of the building itself rather than something the building was borrowing from a source. He kept his hand there for a long moment. Garrett Finch came last. He did not knock. He appeared in the doorway when Clara opened it to check the approach, whether anyone else was coming, whether she could see anything at all through the white obliteration. And he was simply there, in the space the open door revealed. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was deeply cold, but standing without difficulty. His eyes were clear. He said nothing. There was nothing in his expression that resembled what she had expected. No defiance, no performance. Just a man standing in a storm, on the step of a house built by a woman he had tried to take from her, with nowhere else to go. Clara held the door. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He stepped inside. Stone watched him enter, did not move. Garrett walked past the dog and found a space along the east wall, away from everyone else, and sat down with his back against the stone and his knees drawn up, and looked at nothing in particular. Wade came 20 minutes later with two of the men from the store. He came through the door and stopped when he was inside and looked around at the room and at the people in it, at Mabel Stout and her daughter, at Harrow standing near the north wall, at Garrett in the corner. Then he looked at the wall above the small doorway that led to the storage area, the interior wall where Eli had spent part of an afternoon in September with a chisel and a piece of sandstone, carving letters into the face of the rock. 2 words, Voss's Folly. Wade stood looking at those words for a long time, longer than he had intended to. His face moved through something that he clearly had not planned for and was not sure what to do with. Clara was watching him from across the room. He turned, met her eyes, then looked down, which was, from Wade, more than she had expected. The room was crowded. 15 people, eventually, pulled in by ones and twos through the long first night, arriving with varying degrees of damage, none of them having planned to end up here, all of them finding that here was the only place available. Clara organized without performing it. She moved people to where warmth was greatest, distributed the food she had without commentary on how much or how little there was, found blankets and space, and made the small practical decisions that needed making, one at a time, continuously, without stopping to assess how she felt about any of it. Eli helped without being asked. He found things before they were needed. He knew where everything was stored because he had helped store it. And he moved through the space with a quiet competence that was startling in a 9-year-old and entirely his own. At some point, deep in the second night, long after Rose had woken, registered the crowd with wide eyes and decided with the pragmatic flexibility of the very young that this was simply the current state of things and gone back to sleep. Clara took the notebook from beneath the bench. The room was dark except for the fire and the small lamp. Most people were sleeping or close to it. Stone had found a position near Mabel's daughter and had not moved from it in several hours. Clara sat at the table. She opened the notebook to the last page. She unfolded the paper that had been tucked there for 11 years. Her father's handwriting. The same cramped and careful hand that had filled the preceding pages with the mathematics of warmth and the geometry of stone. But different in register, the way a person's voice is different when they're speaking to someone specific rather than recording information for general use. She read, "For Clara, who will need this more than her brothers ever will. Build well, my darling. The stone will remember, even when the people forget." She sat very still. He had known. Not that she would need this specific knowledge in this specific situation. He couldn't have known that, but he had known something about her, something he had seen in her when she was young, some quality he had recognized and decided to prepare for even before she knew what she would face. He had given her the notebook. He had won the legal case and left it in the records where it could be found. He had written this note and folded it and placed it where she would open it when she was ready. He had done all of this before she knew any of it would matter. Clara looked at the fire for a long time. Then she looked around the room, at the people sleeping against the walls of the house she had built, at the stone that held their warmth without asking anything in return, at Eli asleep in the corner, with Stone's bulk pressed companionably against his side. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the walls were not already saying. She folded the note carefully along its original creases, placed it back in the notebook, closed it, and set it on the table in front of her, and sat with her hands resting on the worn leather cover, in the warmth that her father's knowledge had made possible. She did not get up to check the fire. The fire did not need checking. The walls had it. The storm pressed against the outside of the stone house and found nothing to press against, only mass and patience and the deep, settled warmth of something that does not argue with cold. Stone waits. It waited now. The second day inside the stone house was different from the first. The first day had been about survival. The immediate physical business of getting people warm, getting them fed, getting them settled into the unfamiliar arrangement of sharing a small space with people they had not chosen to be close to. There had been enough urgency in that to keep everyone focused outward, on the practical, on the next thing that needed doing. Urgency is useful that way. It keeps people from having to look at each other. The second day had no urgency left in it. The storm had not changed. If anything, it had deepened, the sound against the walls becoming something so constant it had ceased to register as sound and become instead a kind of permanent atmosphere of the inside. But the immediate crisis was resolved. Everyone was warm. Everyone had eaten something. The wounds that needed tending had been tended. What remained when the urgency lifted was the people themselves, 15 of them in a space built for 3, arranged against the walls in their separate silences, in the particular discomfort of people who know each other well enough to have established opinions about each other, but not well enough, not in this context, not in this arrangement, to know what to do with those opinions now. Clara watched this without drawing attention to the watching. She had learned over years of managing situations with insufficient resources that understanding what a room needed before the room knew it needed anything was more useful than any action taken after the need became obvious. What the room needed, she decided, was something to do. She gave Eli the food distribution first, not because it was the most important task, but because Eli was 9 years old, and the room was full of adults, and he needed something that was unambiguously his. A responsibility that could not be questioned or seconded or improved upon by someone with more years and louder confidence. She explained the inventory quietly. What they had, how long it needed to last, the portions that would keep everyone adequately fed without exhausting the supply before the storm broke. Eli listened with the particular attention he brought to things he understood mattered. He was a serious child. He had always been serious. Even before Thomas died, even before the winters became something to be managed rather than simply endured. But the seriousness had changed since last spring. It had acquired depth, the way a voice acquires depth, through use and the passage of time and the specific education of having been trusted with things that were actually serious. He took the task and carried it without complaint and without performance, moving around the room with a quiet steadiness that drew attention without demanding it. When he handed a portion to Mabel's daughter, the child had been largely silent since they arrived. He crouched down to the child's level and presented the food as though it were something offered rather than allocated. "There's enough," Eli told her, matter-of-factly. Not comforting, exactly. He was not a performatively comforting child, but certain. "There's enough for everyone. My ma measured it." The girl looked at him for a moment, then at the food, then reached out with the careful seriousness of a child who has understood, without being told, that things are not ordinary right now. She ate. Clara, watching from across the room, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The moment with Stone came in the middle of the second afternoon. Mabel Stout's daughter, her name was Grace, and she was 7, and she had not spoken since they arrived, had positioned herself in the corner nearest the door. Not because it was the warmest corner, which it wasn't, but because it was the corner from which she could see the most of the room while remaining closest to the exit. Clara recognized this geometry. She had used it herself, in other rooms, in other difficult years. Grace had eaten when food was offered. She had accepted a blanket when one was brought to her, but she had not spoken, and her eyes moved in the careful pattern of a child who is tracking everything without wanting to be noticed doing it. Stone found her in the middle of the afternoon. He was not directed there. Clara had not suggested it. He simply arrived with the unhurried purposefulness that characterized everything he did, and lowered himself to the floor beside the girl, not touching her, not requiring anything of her, simply establishing himself as present in the way that dogs establish presence, as a fact of the landscape rather than a demand. Grace looked at him. Stone looked at the fire. The silence between them lasted a long time, long enough that the rest of the room had stopped pretending not to notice. Long enough that Mabel, across the room with her back against the west wall, had gone very still. Then Grace moved, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to take an action they are not entirely sure about, and placed her hand on Stone's flank. The dog exhaled, a long, slow release, the kind that goes all the way down, the kind that changes the whole shape of a breathing body. He closed his eyes. Grace kept her hand where it was. Her fingers moved slightly, just slightly, in the way fingers move when they are registering texture, taking information in. The room was completely quiet. Then, barely above a whisper, so quiet that only the people nearest to her would have caught it, Grace said, "Can I keep petting the dog?" No one answered immediately. Because the question had arrived with such quietness and such weight that the room needed a moment to receive it. Mabel made a sound. Clara had heard grief before, and relief before, and the particular amalgam of the two that belongs to parents. The sound that comes when a child who has been somewhere unreachable comes back. Mabel's hand went to her mouth. "Yes," Eli said from across the room, with the calm authority of someone who has the relevant expertise. "He likes it." Grace nodded, kept petting. Stone did not move. Clara turned away from the scene and looked at the fire, which did not require her attention, but gave her something to look at while she composed herself. The warmth of the walls pressed against her back, steady, as it had been steady, patient, as it had been patient. Stone doesn't argue with cold, she thought. Stone waits, and so had Grace. In her own way, in her own time, the child had waited until she found the thing that could bring her back. And then she had come back. Children were like that. They knew what they needed. The hard part was making sure the thing they needed was there when they were ready for it. Wade spoke to Eli about the wall the following day. Clara was aware of it afterward through Eli, who told her in the evening with the considered brevity of someone who has thought carefully about what to include. Wade had found Eli near the storage area doing an inventory of the remaining food. He had stood there for a moment, not entirely sure how to begin. Then he had said, "I'm sorry I called it that." Eli had taken a moment, the way Eli always took a moment before he responded to things he was considering seriously. "Ma says the name fits now," Eli said. "We kept it." Wade had stood there in the uncomfortable way of someone who came prepared for one kind of conversation and has found himself in a different one entirely. Eli, in the manner of someone who has decided the matter is settled, held out the inventory and said, "Can you count? I need someone to check my figures." Wade could count. He counted. The figures were correct. They worked through the remainder of the inventory together in a silence that was, by its end, a different quality from how it had begun. Eli told Clara this without editorializing. He had learned not to editorialize from watching her, the way she reported things as they were, and trusted the listener to draw their own conclusions. Clara listened. Then she said, "That was well handled." Eli considered this. "He's all right," he said finally. "He just didn't know yet." Harrow put the drawing on the table while most of the room was sleeping. Clara was awake. She had stopped expecting sleep and begun simply existing in the spaces between necessary actions. She was at the table with a cup of hot water, which was all that was left of anything warm, and the lamp burning low beside her. Harrow came from his position near the north wall and sat down across from her without asking whether she minded. He placed the folded paper on the table between them, left his hand on top of it for a moment, then withdrew it. She looked at the paper. He nodded once. She unfolded it. It was a drawing, cross-section, detailed and precise, with the quality of technical work done by someone who thinks spatially, who can hold a three-dimensional form in their mind and translate it accurately into 2 dimensions on a flat surface. It showed a wall system, timber frame on the exterior, stone core built inside it, packed earth filling the gap between. The proportions were correct. The corner detail was thoughtful. The placement of the stone mass relative to the fire source was exactly where it needed to be to maximize absorption and distribution. He had worked out not just the principle, but the practical application. How to retrofit an existing timber cabin rather than building from the ground up. How to use what people already had as the skeleton of what they needed. It was a good drawing. It was more than a good drawing. It was evidence that a mind she had believed was closed had been, privately, open, had been doing the work that open minds do, taking in information and processing it and following it where it led, regardless of where the person wanted it to lead. She looked up at him. He said, "I made that on the second night, when the ice came up inside my own wall." She looked back at the drawing. "It's your principle," he said. "I worked out how to build it into what people here already have." Clara looked at the corner detail, the small, elegant answer to a problem she hadn't thought about because she had built from scratch rather than converting. "That's not a small thing," she said. "That's the difference between an idea and a tool. Both matter." Harrow said nothing. He looked at the drawing with the expression of a man who has made peace with something and is not sure yet how to describe the territory he has entered. "The Dawson family," Clara said. "On the eastern edge. 3 children. The east wall of that cabin is the worst in the valley." Harrow nodded slowly. "I know that cabin. When the storm breaks," Clara said. "That would be a good place to start." He refolded the drawing and put it back in his coat pocket, close to his chest. He stood up, looked at the north wall, the wall buried deepest in the hillside, the one she had spent the most time on, the one that had given her the most difficulty and the most satisfaction. He put his hand on it, held it there. The stone was warm. He took his hand away and went back to his place along the wall without saying anything more, but the drawing was in his pocket, and they both knew what the pocket meant. Edmund Wren sat down beside Clara sometime in the third night. Not at the table. He sat on the floor near the fireplace, at an angle to her, close enough for a quiet conversation, but not demanding one. For a while, they didn't speak. The fire had burned down to a steady coal bed, and the room held its warmth in the particular way it always held it, without drama, without effort, as a simple ongoing fact. The sound of the storm outside had become so familiar it had ceased to be sound and become atmosphere, the permanent condition of the world beyond the walls. Wren put his hand flat against the stone beside the fireplace. He had done this many times before, the measurement habit, the data collection. But this time he left his hand there longer than measurement required. And when he finally spoke, what he said was not about numbers. "Your father was right about everything," he said. Clara looked at the fire. "He usually was." A silence. Then, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." He was. She paused. He was the kind of person who prepared for things he hoped would never happen, because he thought preparation was a form of love. He never explained it that way, but that's what it was. Wren looked at her. The lamplight was low, and the room was full of sleeping people. And there was nothing ceremonial about the moment. No framing, no occasion. Just 2 people sitting on the floor of a stone house in the middle of a storm, saying things they meant. "You're the same way," he said. Clara did not answer immediately. She thought about the notebook and the night she had decided to build, and every morning she had walked out to the work site before anyone else was awake. She thought about Rose's hands in winter, and Eli sitting alone in the dark at 8 years old, feeding a fire that should not have been his responsibility. "I'm trying to be," she said. Wren did not say anything else. He did not need to. He remained where he was, and she remained where she was. And after a while, the silence became the comfortable kind, the kind between people who have moved past the need to fill it. At some point, Clara became aware that his shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of her coat. A different kind of warmth. The kind that has a source you can name. She did not move away. He did not move away. Stone, from across the room, opened one eye, looked at them both, closed it again. She found Rose before dawn. Had not been looking for her exactly, had simply risen in the way she had been rising throughout the storm to check the fire and the people and do the small ongoing accounting of a space that had too many inhabitants and not enough of most things. She moved through the room carefully, stepping between the sleeping shapes, and found Rose in the low loft above the main room where she and Eli had been sleeping. Rose was asleep. This was not surprising, but the quality of it was. Clara stood at the top of the ladder and listened. Rose was not coughing. Had not coughed since the storm began. 3 days, 3 nights, 3 mornings. Without the particular sound that had become, over 3 winters, as reliable a feature of the cold season as the cold itself. Not the cough of serious illness, but of persistent vulnerability, of a small body that had never quite found peace with winter, that fought it in its sleep with the only weapons available to sleeping children. Clara listened to the silence where the cough should have been. She stood there for a long time. The warmth in the loft was different from the warmth below, slightly higher, because warmth rises and the low ceiling of the loft kept it from going anywhere, which was exactly what the notebook had described, which was exactly why she had built the loft the way she had built it. The theory was correct. She had known the theory was correct. But theory is one thing, and this specific sleeping child in this specific silence was another. This was the thing she had built toward without knowing exactly that she was building toward it. Not the legal case, not the thermometer readings, not Harrow's drawing or Wren's data or the Valley's changed opinion. This, Rose sleeping through the cold without coughing. Clara had spent 3 years in a battle with the wrong enemy. She had thought she was fighting the cold. The cold was just cold. Indifferent. Impersonal. The same cold it had always been. What she had been fighting was inadequacy. The specific inadequacy of a structure that could not do what a structure was supposed to do. And she had fixed it. She put her hand against the wall of the loft. Warm. She stayed until the light through the canvas began to change. The particular change that meant the storm was not over, but was beginning, very slowly, to consider the possibility of being over. A lightening, not of warmth, but of intensity. The sound outside shifted almost imperceptibly towards something that had less conviction in it than it had the night before. Then she climbed back down and rebuilt the fire and began the business of the morning. Garrett was still in his corner. He was awake. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the controlled stillness of someone managing wakefulness rather than the unconscious stillness of sleep. He was looking at the east wall, or at nothing, or at something between the two. Clara filled a bowl from the pot that had been simmering overnight on the low heat of the banked fire. The last of the dried beans, stretched with water and a little salt, and whatever else was still available. She brought it to where Garrett sat. He looked at the bowl, then at her, then away. He took it. That was all. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything. He did not apologize, did not explain, did not offer any of the words that the situation might have made available to him had he been a different kind of man, or in a different kind of moment. Clara looked at him for one moment. At the brother-in-law who had come to her door the morning after her husband's funeral with a price for her land, who had told her Thomas would have wanted his children fed as though she were the one failing them, who had gone to Preston Cobb with a lie about her mind. And she felt something that was not forgiveness, not exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific tiredness that comes after a long fight when the fight is not quite over, but you can see the shape of where it ends, and you understand that you are going to be all right, and you no longer need the energy that anger requires. She turned away. There were other people to feed. There was water to heat and a fire to tend and Eli to find and Rose to check and the ongoing work of keeping 15 people functional in a small space for another day. She went to do it. The walls held. The fire held. And somewhere in the east corner of the room, Garrett Finch sat with an empty bowl and said nothing, which was, she had decided, exactly as much as she had ever expected from him. And exactly enough. Outside, the storm was finding its limit. The silence came before the light. Clara had been awake for some time when she noticed it. Not the silence of the room, which had its own particular texture of breathing and the small sounds of sleeping people, but the silence beyond the walls. The storm had been a constant presence for so long that its absence registered as a new sound, the way a clock you've stopped hearing becomes suddenly audible when it stops. She lay still and listened to the nothing. Then she got up. The fire needed 2 logs and a few minutes of attention before it found its rhythm again. The room was warm, not dramatically, not the aggressive warmth of a fire burning at full output, but the steady, settled warmth that had become the defining quality of the space, the thing that separated inside from outside more completely than any wall she had ever known. She added the logs and crouched beside the stove and listened to the silence outside confirm itself. The storm was over. She went to the south window and lifted the canvas. The world outside was white and broken and absolutely still. Drifts had formed against every vertical surface, reaching in some places to the window ledge, in others piled so high they had changed the topography of the familiar ground into something new and unfamiliar. The sky above the ridge was a pale, clear blue that looked freshly made. The specific blue of air that has been thoroughly cleaned of everything that was in it before. It was cold. She could feel it through the canvas, through the gap she'd made, against the back of her hand. The cold of a world after a storm. Not the aggressive, driving cold of the storm itself, but the still, clarified cold of aftermath. The kind that simply is what it is, without intention. Clara let the canvas fall. She turned back to the room. 15 people, most of them still sleeping, stone asleep beside Grace, who had not moved from that position in 2 days and showed no signs of wanting to. Eli in the loft above, Rose beside him. She went to start breakfast with what was left. They left in 1s and 2s through the morning. Each departure had its own character. The woman from the North End, whose husband had not come because his pride had been larger than his good sense, left with her daughter and a brevity that Clara recognized as someone who was still working out what the experience had meant and was not ready to speak about it. She said thank you in the quiet voice of someone meaning it beyond the surface of the words. And Clara nodded, and that was sufficient. Wade paused at the door and turned back and looked at the carved letters on the wall. Voss's Folly. And then at Clara, and opened his mouth, and then closed it again. He put his hat on and left. Whatever he had been going to say, he would say it later, or he wouldn't. Either way, the carved letters existed, and he had counted inventory with Eli. And some of what he had been before the storm had been rearranged by the days inside this room in ways that would take time to fully settle. Harrow left with the drawing still in his coat pocket. He stopped at the door and turned to look at the north wall one more time. The wall she had buried deepest in the hillside. The wall that had been warm to the touch throughout the entire storm. He stood looking at it for a moment with the expression of a man revising something fundamental, not with distress, with the particular quality of revision that belongs to people who are honest enough to follow an argument wherever it leads, once they've stopped arguing about the argument. He turned to Clara. "The Dawson family," he said. "Yes," she said. He left. Clara watched him go through the south window. He walked with the same unhurried deliberateness as always. No performance of humility, no altered posture, no visible sign that anything had changed. But the drawing was in his pocket. He was going to build something. And when he built it, the walls of it would carry something forward that she had started. That was the only kind of credit that lasted. Mabel Stout was the last to leave, aside from Edmund Wren, who had taken on the unspoken role of staying until everyone else was gone. Grace had been gently separated from Stone that morning, not easily and not without negotiation, but Eli had managed it with a patience and seriousness that Clara had watched from across the room with the particular attention she gave to things she wanted to remember. Mabel stood at the door with Grace's hand in hers. Grace was looking back at Stone, who was sitting near the fire, looking at Grace with the patient attention of an old dog who has lived long enough to understand that most good things are temporary, and that this does not make them less good. Mabel looked at Clara. There was a long moment in which neither of them spoke, because what needed to be said was large enough that ordinary words would not hold it, and both of them understood that. "I was wrong," Mabel said finally, not with drama, quietly, the way people say the true things when they've decided to stop not saying them. "About the house, about what I said, about most of it." Clara looked at her, the woman who had worried publicly, who had nodded in the store, who had been one of the many faces of a resistance that had its real source elsewhere, but had needed other faces to wear. "I know," Clara said. "Not I forgive you. Not it's all right. Just I know. The acknowledgement of a truth being spoken, received honestly, between two people who were both still standing." Mabel nodded. She took Grace through the door. Grace looked back at Stone one more time. Stone thumped his tail twice on the floor. The accounting of what the storm had cost began quietly, the way such accountings begin, not with formal announcement, but with the gradual accumulation of information that arrives through the usual channels of a small community, each piece small enough on its own, significant in its combination. Clara heard about the Forsyth family through Ike Mathers, who came by on the second day after the storm to leave a bundle of cured hide she hadn't asked for, and to deliver the news in the direct, unsentimental way of someone who has learned that delivering difficult information efficiently is a form of respect. The Forsyths had not come to the Stone house, not because they hadn't known where it was. Everyone in the valley knew by now where it was. But because Elias Forsyth had declared at the settlement store before the storm, in the company of several men, that he would not take shelter in a widow's folly. He had said this in the particular voice of a man making a public commitment, the kind that becomes harder to rescind the more public it is. He had survived. His wife had survived. Their children had survived. Their livestock had not. The barn had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and the animals that were not killed outright had scattered into a landscape that did not return them. By spring, the Forsyths would be selling their homestead claim to cover what they had lost. They would move east, toward a larger town, toward a different kind of life. Before they left, Elias Forsyth drove his wagon past the stone house and stopped it on the trail and sat there for a long moment looking at the walls. Clara saw him from the south window. She did not go to the door. He drove on. She stood at the window after he was gone and felt the specific sadness of a cost that had not been necessary. Not triumph. She was past triumph. Had moved through that territory and come out the other side into something quieter and more durable, but sadness, real and unperformed. A man's stubbornness had cost him everything he'd built, and it had not needed to. The door would have been open. The walls would have held him as well as they held anyone else. She had told them all. She had gone door to door. The door had been open. Some things you cannot force. You can only build the shelter and open the door and live with what people do with the choice. Garrett came on a gray morning a week after the storm. He came alone, as he always came to things he had no intention of sharing. He tied his horse to Thomas's post and walked to the door and knocked with the particular efficiency of a man who has prepared what he's going to say and wants to get through it. Clara opened the door. He looked the same as he always looked. No visible evidence of the storm in him, no evidence of the 3 days he had spent sitting in her corner eating her food. He had reconstituted himself into the version of Garrett Finch that operated in the world, and that version did not carry marks. "I'm withdrawing the dwelling review," he said. "All of it." Clara looked at him evenly. "I know you are." Something moved through his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at finding no resistance where he had prepared for some. The precedent case. Edmund Wren filed it with the territorial office 2 weeks before the storm, Clara said. The review was already resolved. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Then why didn't you—" He stopped himself. "Because you needed to come and say it yourself," Clara said. "And because I was building a house and didn't have time to explain to you how your own legal situation worked." Another silence. Garrett looked at the stone wall beside the door, at the texture of it, the rough-fitted courses, the mortar joints that Ike Mathers had corrected with weathered patience. He looked at it the way people look at things they have been wrong about and are trying to understand how they were wrong. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Garrett Finch was built in a way that made apology structurally difficult, not because he lacked conscience, but because the architecture of his self-regard did not include a door that opened in that direction. He knew what he had done. She knew what he had done. The knowing was shared, and the shared knowing was as close to accountability as he was going to come. "The land is yours," he said. "I won't be back." "I know," Clara said. He untied his horse. He mounted with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. He rode south on the trail that led away from the valley, and Clara watched him until the trail curved around the stand of bare-limbed trees, and he was gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the empty trail. At the post, Thomas had set into the ground the first spring they arrived. At the land that stretched south and away into distance that had always been his direction, and was now simply the direction that led away. Then Eli appeared at her elbow. From the storage area, she thought, or perhaps the loft, wherever he had positioned himself to hear without being visible, which was a habit she had never discouraged because it was too useful to discourage. He didn't say sorry, Eli said. No, but he's gone. Yes. Eli considered this. He was looking at the trail where Garrett had been, with the thoughtful expression he wore when he was working something out. Is that enough? He asked. Clara looked at her son. He was 9 years old, and he was asking the question that philosophers and theologians had been unable to settle for a very long time, in the specific and practical way that children ask questions, not rhetorically, but because he actually wanted to know and believed she might have an answer. It's what we have, she said. And yes, it's enough. Eli nodded slowly, the particular nod that meant he was filing the answer away rather than simply accepting it, that he would think about it further, test it against other things he knew, arrive at his own version of it in time. He was his father's son in so many ways. But this, the filing away, the independent examination, the refusal to take anything purely on authority, this was hers. Preston Cobb came the following week. He came with his journal under his arm and the specific posture of a man who has decided to do something that costs him something and has worked out that the cost is appropriate. He sat at Clara's table and opened the journal to a page. She had seen it once before, briefly, in the dark of the storm when Wren had brought it as evidence. She had not been meant to read it then. She read it properly now, because Cobb needed her to, because this was his version of the evidence instead of words that was the only language some people had for the things they were most ashamed of. The entry began. The Voss woman is right about the stone. She pushed the journal back. I'm going to make a formal entry in the settlement record, he said, describing the construction and the results of this winter, and stating for the record that the Voss stone house represents a proven and legitimate homestead improvement. He paused. I should have done this in September. I should have done it in August, when I first understood that you were right and that my reasons for not saying so were not good reasons. Clara looked at him steadily. He did not look away. There was a night in August, she said, after you came here with that document, when I sat with my father's notebook and considered stopping. Not because I thought I was wrong about the stone, because I was tired of being right in a way that no one wanted to hear. Cobb absorbed this without speaking. I didn't stop, she said, but I want you to understand that your silence had a weight, not just the document. The silence. I understand, he said. Good, she said. Then write what you need to write. He took his journal and left. He did not apologize in words. He had already said the thing that was more honest than words, and she had received it, and they both understood what the next entry in his journal would say, and that it would be in the official record afterward, permanent and attributed. Eli was in the back room when Cobb left. He came out with a thoughtful expression that meant he had been listening. Was he sorry? Eli asked. Clara considered this. In his way. What does that mean? She thought about how to answer, not whether to answer, which was never in question, but how to find the version of the truth that Eli could actually use. He was a child who would be a man someday, and the man he became would be shaped in part by the answers she gave him now, and she took that seriously. Some people, she said, don't know how to say the thing directly, so they show you the evidence that they knew they were wrong. It costs more than an apology, because you can say words in a moment, but showing evidence means admitting what you knew and when you knew it. And it lasts longer, because it's in the record now. not just in the air between two people. Eli turned this over. Then, is it better than apologizing? For a man like that, Clara said, it's the only apology there is. Edmund Wren proposed on a Tuesday evening in early spring, when the light had begun to hold past the middle of the afternoon, and the south-facing slopes were showing the first tentative brown at their edges. He came, as he always came, with something practical in hand, a bag of early seed corn he'd been trying to source for weeks, because Clara had mentioned once that the valley variety had been yielding poorly. He brought it inside and set it on the table, and then did not leave, which was not unusual, and then said what he wanted to say, which was, he said he had been thinking for some time about the question of what he wanted the rest of his life to look like. He said that the answer he kept arriving at involved this house and these children and this woman in that order, and that he was aware this was a significant thing to say and did not expect an immediate answer. Clara looked at the bag of seed corn. She looked at Edmund Wren, who had come with a thermometer and a notebook to collect data, and had instead collected something he hadn't been looking for, and who had the good sense to recognize what it was when he found it. She said, "Ask Eli." Wren blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Ask Eli," she said again. "He's been taking your measure since the first week you came here. He's had an opinion for months. If his opinion is what I think it is, then my answer is yes." Wren was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the ladder that led to the loft and called up. Eli appeared at the top of the ladder with the expression of someone who has been listening to a conversation for longer than they are prepared to admit. "Mr. Wren wants to know something," Clara said. Eli looked at Wren. Wren looked at Eli. The negotiation was conducted in a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. "Father would have liked you," Eli said. He respected people who measured things properly. He climbed back up the ladder. From somewhere above, Rose's voice arrived, clear and certain. "I already decided a long time ago." Clara looked at Edmund Wren. "Well," she said, "there's your answer." They married in the stone house that autumn, with Eli and Rose as the only witnesses needed. The ceremony was brief, and the food was simple, and the walls were warm, as they always were, and that was sufficient. It was, Clara thought afterward, exactly the right kind of wedding for two people who had already decided the important things and were formalizing what had already been true for some time. The spring that followed was long and generous, as if the valley were compensating for what it had taken in winter. Harrow finished the Dawson job in March, working through the last cold weeks because Daniel Dawson had 3 children and the east wall had been losing the battle for years. The composite construction, timber shell, stone interior, packed earth between, went up slowly, with the patience that stone requires, and that Harrow had spent decades of timber work not needing to develop and was now developing for the first time. He found that he did not mind the patience. He found, in fact, that he preferred it. There was something in the work itself that he had not encountered before. Not the satisfaction of completing a thing quickly and well, but the different satisfaction of doing a thing at the pace the material required, of submitting to the logic of what you were building rather than imposing your own schedule on it. When the Dawson family moved back in and stood in the warmed room and felt the difference in the air, the way the heat distributed without urgency to every corner rather than concentrating near the stove and fading as you moved away, Daniel Dawson looked at Harrow and said, "It feels like a different house." "It is a different house," Harrow said. He rode home that evening and took the original drawing from his coat pocket, the drawing he had made alone in the night during the blizzard, when ice was growing on his own wall and the arithmetic had finally won the argument with his pride. He unfolded it on his workbench and looked at it for a long time. Then he got out fresh paper and began copying it cleanly, adding dimensions, annotating details, turning a private calculation into a document another builder could actually use. He called it a composite wall specification. He did not put his name on it. People called it the Voss method. The name attached with the particular persistence of practical names, and Harrow did not object. He had not invented the principle. He had built the tool. The tool had earned its name from the person who understood what needed building in the first place. Mabel Stout rebuilt the north wing of her house in stone that spring. She supervised the work herself, which surprised the men she hired and then stopped surprising them, because it became clear very quickly that she knew what she wanted and had specific reasons for wanting it. She had measured Clara's wall thickness from memory. Her hand had been flat against it long enough during the storm that the dimension lived in her palm like something she'd learned without meaning to. The north wing went up in 6 weeks. That winter, it was the warmest room in the house. Grace claimed it as her own. Edmund Wren's paper, the record of temperature measurements he had collected throughout the year, was sent to a scientific journal and accepted some months later. It appeared under a dry and technical title that gave no indication of the story behind the numbers. Clara's name did not appear in the text. It appeared in the acknowledgments in a single line, with particular gratitude to C. Voss, whose understanding of the principle preceded the measurements by considerably. Clara read this line sitting at her table with her morning coffee. She read it twice. Then she folded the journal to that page and placed it in the trunk with her father's notebook, with the legal ruling, with the note from the last page that she had finally opened in the dark of the storm. She did not say anything about it to anyone that day. Some things settled better in silence. Stone had been slowing through the second winter after the blizzard. Not dramatically, because he was not a dog that did anything dramatically. But Clara noticed the way he took longer to find his spot each morning, the way he stayed closer to the fire than he used to, the way his eyes, when he looked at her, held the particular patience of an animal that has arrived somewhere and is not in a hurry to leave. He spent his last weeks in a particular patch of sunlight on the south side of the stone house, where the wall released its warmth into the afternoon in a way that the old dog seemed to find deeply satisfying, and which Clara suspected was the reason he had chosen that spot with such consistency. He was not dramatic about his slowness. He simply moved at the pace that was available to him and seemed to find it sufficient. He died in his sleep, near the fire, in the middle of a night when nothing else was happening. Eli found him in the morning. He sat beside Stone for a while without moving, in the way of someone who knows what they're looking at and is taking the time to look at it properly before anything else begins. Then he went to tell Clara, quietly, with the directness he had always brought to difficult information. They buried Stone in the corner of the east garden, in the ground that was beginning to soften with spring. Eli dug the hole. Rose brought the flat piece of sandstone she had been saving for this purpose. She had known, in the way of young people who pay attention, that the time was coming, and she had found the right stone months earlier and kept it where she could find it. She had not carved it yet. She carved it now, crouching in the thin spring light with a narrow chisel and the careful deliberateness she had inherited from her mother. She carved Stone. He waited with us. Eli set the marker at the head of the grave. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, Clara, Eli, Rose, and Stone below them in the warming earth. and the stone house behind them holding the last of the morning's warmth in its walls. Clara looked at the marker, at the carved letters, at the name. "Good dog," she said. Then she turned and went inside, and after a moment the children followed, and the spring morning continued around the small grave in the east garden, warming gradually as the sun moved, the stone marker absorbing the light the way all stone absorbs light, slowly, completely, without hurry. Many years passed. Eli grew tall and serious and studied law with the focused determination of someone who has understood from childhood that systems can be used against people, and that understanding how they work is a form of protection. He had seen it work against his mother. The document with 45 days written on it, the legal maneuver designed not to win on the merits, but to exhaust and discourage. And he had decided at 9 years old, in a room full of frightened people in a storm, that he would spend his working life being the person who found the precedent that other lawyers had not looked for. He kept that promise. He specialized in property disputes and homestead claims and the particular legal situations of women and families in difficult circumstances, and he was known, in the territory, as someone who could be counted on to find the argument buried in the old records. He understood the value of what was already written down. He had learned it from his mother, who had learned it from her father, who had known, without being told, that the things you write down and leave in the right places become weapons for the people who come after you. Rose became a naturalist and a teacher, someone who moved between the two identities with the ease of a person who does not see them as separate. She spent her early years learning the land the way her mother had learned stone, by handling it, by asking it questions, by paying attention to what it told her before she told it anything. She wrote a book about the construction methods her mother had used, drawing on the notebook and her own observations in the years of watching the stone house perform across every kind of winter the territory could produce. The book was practical and careful and entirely uninterested in being impressive. It was useful. It was used. She dedicated it for our grandfather, who wrote things down for someone he trusted to need them. Clara was old when her granddaughter, Eli's daughter, a child with her great-grandfather's habit of sitting very still while taking in a great deal, came to visit on a winter afternoon and stood in the main room of the stone house and looked at everything with the focused attention of someone memorizing. She was 7 years old. She had heard the story. She wanted to see the thing itself. Clara sat in the chair by the south window, where the low winter light came in at an angle that warmed the floor and the wall and the side of her face. She had been sitting in this chair for years, in this light, in this warmth. The house was the same house it had always been. The walls rougher now, the mortar in some joints replaced twice, the sod roof long since converted to something more durable, but the walls themselves unchanged. The walls had not moved, because walls built the way those walls were built do not move. The granddaughter climbed into the chair beside her. It was a wide chair, there was room, and looked at the north wall and then at Clara. "Grandma," she said, "were you scared when you built it?" Clara looked at her granddaughter, at the particular combination of her son's directness and something else, something older, something that skipped generations the way certain qualities do, landing in unexpected places. She thought about the morning after the funeral, the night with the 3 matches, the legal document with 45 days written on it, the night she had nearly picked up the pen. "Every single day," she said, The girl thought about this. Then how did you keep going? Clara turned and placed her hand on the wall beside the chair. The stone was warm under her palm, had been warm for decades, had been warm for longer than this child had been alive, would be warm after Clara was not. She felt the warmth move into her hand and up through her wrist, and she thought about her father's hands, and her father's father's hands, and the people in Cornwall whose names nobody remembered, but whose knowledge had moved forward through time by passing from one person to the next, each one carrying it as far as they could go, and then finding the next person to give it to. The stone, she said, stone doesn't argue with cold. It doesn't fight it. It doesn't run from it. A pause. It waits. It holds what it's been given, and then it gives it back, slowly, to whoever needs it. The granddaughter was looking at her with the full attention of a child who is receiving something she understands is important. "And so did we," Clara said. The afternoon light moved along the floor. The fire burned at its moderate, unhurried pace. The stone walls held their warmth the way they always held it, without drama, without effort, as a simple and ongoing fact. The granddaughter reached out and put her own small hand on the wall. She felt it. Her eyes changed. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Everything your grandfather taught you?" Clara looked at the child's hand on the warm stone. She looked at the notebook on the shelf above the fireplace. Worn leather, the edges soft with years of handling. The last page finally read and folded and read again many times since. She thought about what it meant to be the person a thing was left for, the person someone trusted to need it. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach you everything." Outside, the winter afternoon was deepening into the long blue cold of evening. The mountains to the north stood white and patient against a sky just beginning to show its first stars. Inside the stone house, the walls remembered every fire that had ever been lit in them. They would remember this one too. This ordinary fire, this winter evening, this old woman and her granddaughter sitting together in the warmth of something built a long time ago by hands that understood that what you build outlasts you, and that this is the point, and that the knowing of it is enough. The stone had waited. It was still waiting. It would wait long after all of them were gone, holding the warmth it had been given, giving it back to whoever came next. That was what stone did. That was what it had always done. The Stone That Remembers, a work of fiction. This story is entirely fictional. All characters, events, and locations are invented for the purposes of narrative storytelling.